Well, thank you for showing up this morning at the crack of dawn on Sunday. This is not my time of day. I'm a night person. You know, I like seeing sunrises from the other side. Well, Jim said things that are interesting because he hasn't seen what I'm going to show you yet, and I barely have. As you know, Robin and I just came back from Hawaii, and I had known academically that Hawaii was a kind of a special place, but it's really, really cool when you go to a place that you think is going to be special, and it turns out to be really special. And Hawaii, the Big Island, is really special, and I'm going to be able to show you, measure scientifically how special Hawaii is in relation to some of the stuff we talked about yesterday, and we're going to talk about at the end of this morning. Where to begin? Today is devoted to the foundation, the technology and the physics that makes possible what I talked about yesterday afternoon. If in fact we are heir to a Type II Kardashev civilization, if our dim, distant ancestry going back literally millions of years off this planet in this system encompasses the astonishing wonders that we now see in ruins all around us, then it stands to reason that we ought to be able to measure and quantify and, in essence, make real the foundation of that civilization by measuring right here at home on this planet the fundamentals of that physics. And that's what we've been trying to do, moving from theory into empirical experiment since about 2003. And I'll get into some of the details a little later on and show you how we worked our way into what we think we know now. But as I said a couple minutes ago, if I could find my, there it is, hiding little, okay. Here, and I've been told I have to use this screen because this screen is going out live.
Yes.
Right over there, you see a little tiny wisp of light. That's Hawaii. First thing I want you to notice is these are real images. This is a real Air Force defense mapping satellite that takes nighttime images of the entire planet, and all of this incredible glow is what we are sending to the stars every single night that the Earth turns and presents its shadow side to space. And this incredible brilliance of North America is real. It's also incredibly wasteful. It's not necessary that we do this, but we do this because apparently we don't know any better. Oh, and Europe's not much better, okay? And South America, I mean the whole planet, except for Hawaii, as you're going to see. And there's a reason for that, and it's part of the serendipitous stuff that comes out of doing this kind of research. You coalesce around ideas that suddenly, even though you've known them academically for years, they suddenly make a great deal of sense at a practical level, which is what experience is supposed to give us. So with that as background, if you now look at a Mercator projection, Hawaii is down over here. Is this thing working? Oh, there we are. Right here. What I want you to notice is how much dimmer it is than the splashed lights of the continent of the United States, or as it's called, CONUS. There is a reason for that. In fact, if you look really closely, you'll see that there is a material difference between the various islands, which is not, by the way, a reflection of population. All right, here we'll get a little closer. You can see a little better view. I think we're losing, Jim, I think we're losing the batteries in this thing. So, maybe not. Anyway, so we'll won't dwell on that a whole lot. The reason that Robin and I went to Hawaii is because Hawaii on this planet is the foundation location of this physics. The hyperdimensional torsion field model has as its cornerstone, if tetrahedra can have corners, the 19.47 latitude of Hawaii. that latitude turns out to be a key indicator all across the solar system of enormous energy upwellings from the interior, not only of various planets, big and small, and solid and gaseous, like the gas giants, Jupiter, Saturn, etc., but also of the internal workings of those worlds, and up to and including the sun itself. Did you know, and if you didn't, you're about to, that the peak latitude during the sunspot cycle, the 11-year sunspot cycle, that's more or less 11 years, is at 19.47. The sunspots form parallel bands north and south, paralleling the sun's equator, the active regions of the sun. Now this is blatantly obvious. In fact, it was a solar scientist named Parker that I learned this from many, many years ago, a couple of decades ago, but it doesn't seem to have kind of percolated down to the rest of the scientific community that repetitive cyclic pattern is crucial, is important, and that it is not only typical of this sun, this star, but we've now found with increasingly proficient technology other stars whose surfaces can be not seen yet, really, but figured out, which is a difference. And it turns out that those stars have star spots, some of which are big and hang out like the great red spot of Jupiter at one latitude on the star's surface, and that latitude is 19.47. Now, to simplify, we call it 19.5. I mean, what's 3/100ths of a whatever? So, you'll hear a lot about 19.5 this morning. That's what it really, really means. If I was to walk up to you in a bar, and you were in the know and I was in the know and everybody else in the bar was not in the know, and I didn't want them to know, and I sidled up to you and I said, 19.5, you would know that I knew that we were part of something very special from the other folks in the bar. That's how codes work. So if you want a code, an easy transmittable code for hyperdimensional torsion field physics, which is the physics of the universe, not the stuff we're currently playing with, which is a small subset, a safe subset for all us folks who are not supposed to know how the real stuff works. 19.5 is your code. Try it sometime. Be very interesting. Just walk up to a total stranger and say, 19.5, and see what they do. You know, you might be really surprised what you get invited into. Anyway, you know, liven up your life, you know. So, Robin and I came back from spending about a week at 19.5. And it was everything and then some that it was cracked up to be. Now, part of what I'm going to talk about today is not just physics, you know, the mechanical stuff, how the lights light up and how electricity works and, you know, the foundation of all that. But the other part that this hyperdimensional torsion field model relates to and relates intimately to is what's going on up here, consciousness. Because we have now been able to measure, I'm going to show you the graphs, the impact of mass consciousness on this field. And it's replicable, it's measurable, it's empirical, we can show it. And we were able to do this over the solstice of 2012, just a couple days before the solstice on the 19th at Chichen Itza. And I'm going to show you that because it's very obvious that the model that Graham proposed yesterday morning, that this stuff up here is not really generating what we think and feel and react to and relate to and all that. It's merely a transceiver. It's receiving our transmitted consciousness from some other dimension. And so we're basically walking around VR programs. And when you die, when this part of us goes away, you know, the broadcast simply returns home, wherever that is, until a new vehicle can be created, in which case we can then project us into that new vehicle and walk around and have all kinds of cool experiences and say, oh my, isn't this place strange? I can't seem to beam from one place to another yet. Anyway, so our experience at 19.5, and now you can really see what's interesting about this place. Notice what's different about the various Hawaiian islands. This is Oahu. The Big Island is down here. Notice the difference? The Big Island, that little dot over on the right of the Big Island, that's Hilo. That's the big town at the base of Mauna Kea, which is the place where all the observatories, 12 major telescopes from institutions all over the world hang out on the top of Mauna Kea. Because you're in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, they have deliberately kept all the lights focused down. They have reflectors over the top. So they're not squandering billions of kilowatts into space, which kind of looks cool if you're in space, you know, on ISIS or some friendly ET going, oh, how are the natives doing? Oh, they're still wasting all that energy. They just don't get it. But the folks on Oahu obviously have a different cultural perception of the folks at Hilo. Because, you know, this is like the continent. It's like the rest of the planet. Hilo is the way we should be living. And it was really interesting because even with the lights reduced, with the reflectors, what you're seeing is the scattered light from signs and door lights and street signs and whatever, and you know, Walmart signs that reflect off the ground and then back into space. So even though there's been a conscious effort to keep the skylighting really, really, really dark from the top of Mauna Kea, which is 13,700 and some odd feet high, and the skies up there were the most incredible. I said on the coast that night, I have never seen skies like this. And the reason is they have made a super conscious effort. All these government institutions from all over the world have basically politically bought the town council of Hilo, and they have demanded that they keep the skies really, 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 really dark. And everybody benefits because their power bills are lowered. They can see their incredible environment at night. You look up, even walking around in Hilo, you can see the sky, which is more incredible than any sky that you've seen in any city on this planet. It has real benefits if you understand how the universe works and you try to take advantage of the efficiency. So, the basis of the physics is the spiraling energy patterns inside rotating planetary bodies, which emerges at 19.47 north and south, coalesces in 3D into a vortex in the liquid or gaseous mantles of whichever planet or star you're looking at, and then emerges as an energy location at the surface at 19.5. On Earth, as we've just said, that emergent point is Hawaii. But I never in a million years thought that I would have the ability, as we just did, to go there and to actually get the empirical science to prove the theory of what we're saying. This, by the way, is a view from the top of Mauna Kea. And this is still the lights of Hilo. Notice how many lights there still are, even though they make a real conscious effort. It's very hard to shield the sky from lighting when you make profligate use of it, which even in Hilo, there's plenty of electricity and people, you know, live normal lives, 21st century. But it winds up producing an environment that is conducive to some astonishing views when you go up that mountain. Now, as we ended yesterday afternoon's talk, I was discussing the possibility of hyperdimensional torsion field physics influences or effects on Earth from an event which may or may not happen at the end of next year. In October of 2014, October 19th, there is a large celestial body, a comet, which is racing toward encounter, rendezvous, and maybe impact. We don't have the orbits down sharp enough yet to know whether it's going to be a close miss or a hit. But to my mind, given that the numbers around the trajectory are such that it's supposed to either pass closest or impact at 19.5 hours Greenwich Mean Time on the 19th, it seems pretty obvious to me that somebody has arranged this. And if that's so, the next question has to be, why? There could be some major lessons at all levels of this planetary culture. This could be a game-changing event in an extraordinarily positive sense. Unless, of course, you're sitting on Mars. And even then, depends on where you are. So, we left you with the cliffhanger that this, in fact, might take place, that there might be a spectacular event which we could view from the safe distance of about, I think we're going to be maybe, 70, 80 million miles away. But at a key angle of 60 degrees to the sun, and if you have something hitting Mars, this is a shock cone, the explosion, the blast wave, this is the southern hemisphere of Mars. The energy, if this object, which is estimated, by the way, I didn't mention this yesterday, it's estimated, even though it's well at the orbit of Jupiter, and you can't see it as an object, you see it as a dot, as a point of light, even in the world's biggest telescopes. Even in Hubble, it's only a speck. The estimate is this thing could be as much as 30 miles across. Now, if it's an ordinary comet, which the model is, the comets are, basically icebergs, chunks of ice. You do the calculation, sphere, 30 miles, one hand. Okay, that's millions and millions of tons of stuff moving, and this is going to really freak some people out, at the order of 30 miles per second by the time it reaches the orbit of Mars, whipping around the sun and then going back out. That object colliding with a solid surface at that speed and that mass and that size is what could deliver as much as 20 billion megatons of energy into space, into Mars, into the environs. And you could think of it as, well, it's safely over there, it's not here. It's going to be a spectacular show. The problem with that reasoning is that it's occurring, again, coincidence seems not to be part of this equation. It's occurring when Mars and Sun and Earth are separated by this 60-degree angle. And 60 degrees in the physics is, of course, the key hyperdimensional angle. Now, why are these solid angles so important? Because we're really looking at waves. And waves emitted at certain angles interfere with other waves emitted at those angles and cause exquisite interference patterns. If you want to play with this, put water in the sink and put some things in it and start shaking them around and watch the ripples and watch how they interact. And this is called ripple tank, experimental physics. It really comes down to a translation between a frozen moment in time, geometry, and moving energy, waves, which are waveforms. So you can think of it as moving stuff, that's the energy moving through space as waves, or a snapshot, a stroboscopic slice of time, which is a solid moment captured, which shows you the instantaneous momentary geometry that produces those waves. If you do something simple like this, and I should use this screen, you can connect these points so that you wind up with a hexagon. Nice, symmetrical, six-sided figure, which really is not only the double tetrahedron inscribed inside it, but it is telling us, when we see this appearing in nature, that physics of this sort is quite likely occurring. That you have an event, you have effects, you have gas flows, you have dynamic pressures, you have blast waves, and all of that creates physical phenomenon that leaves behind, when the explosion has passed, an imprint, a frozen moment in the geometry that reveals the dynamic waveforms that were going on during that instantaneous epoch of the event. The reason this is all important is because these angles and this geometry can, like 19.5, be viewed as a coded symbol of this physics. So, if you're in that bar and you sidle up to somebody and you have a napkin and a pen, if you draw this and look at them quizzically, see what happens. Now, we find this signature figure, this geometry, in the most odd places all over the solar system. This is an actual real color photograph taken from a couple million miles away, slant range, of the polar hexagon that is perfectly positioned around the North Pole of Saturn. Remember, this is all gaseous atmosphere. These are, ammonia and methane clouds. There's a huge hurricane positioned right over the North Pole, never moves. The Voyagers saw this back in the 1980s, and none of the mainstream guys has a clue from their papers as to what's going on. Which, given all the money we're paying them, is really kind of pathetic. You'd think they would have figured it out by now. But there are political problems, so, we won't go too far in that direction. What's really astonishing is when you start looking at solid objects on other planets. Like, this is a crater. It's a crater on the moon, okay? It's taken by the Japanese space mission Selene. It's popped up on Google, which is why you have all this very standard Google stuff around it. But it's a hexagon. And there are other people that have noticed over the years that a lot of the craters that we have photographed all over the solar system, regardless of the surface composition, regardless of the planet on which we have photographed them, regardless of the materials of that surface of that planet. This is in the Sahara Desert, not too far from Cairo. Let me give you a close-up here. All right. We see, and this one is the famed Herschel crater on Mimas, which is the inner little ice ball moon of Saturn. Notice this stunning hexagonal shape. Now wait a minute. All explosions that we're used to, when you blow something up, you get a sphere, energy flying in all directions, debris and all that. You get spherical or circular shock waves. You don't get geometry. But actually, if you can stop time, which is what this does, it's basically a moment in time. Remember, when everything suddenly cools after the explosion, it turns out that these humongous explosions, here's one on Typhus, all right? This is like a couple 100 miles across in what we believe to be ice. We think Typhus is composed surface, lots of ice, lots of little craters, impacts, bang, 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 bang. Then you have this huge event happen, and the remnant that froze is in the shape of a hexagon. Here's one with 5-sided symmetry. Anybody who read Monuments of Mars, which was the first book I did on what we found at Cydonia, know there's a whole section of the book where I talk about 5- and 6-sided symmetry. That there's a relationship between these two geometric forms. Certainly in terms of the energy flows and patterns, and we're seeing that in something that should be really cut and dried. An impact on a solid surface should leave a sphere, a bowl. It should not leave beautiful geometric patterns. This is the famous Winslow crater. We passed it at dawn. Literally drove past it at dawn out to the left-hand side off the freeway, off 40. And I've been there, Rob and I have been there a couple of times, and it is a stunning place. While you're in northern Arizona, you ought to go there and just see it, because there's a museum on the rim. We actually shot a television show from over here a couple, 3 years ago, which showed up on True TV. Remember the name of the show? Okay. It's produced by Carrie Cassidy, if you know Camelot, and they're probably going to rerun it, because cable reruns things 1,000 times to make more money. And the advantage is if you miss it the first time, you can see it the 400th time. So I was able to get us, because it's very hard to get in here, I was able to get us over on this side. We caravanned around. We had like 12 black SUVs to shoot one lousy TV show, with 90% of the people standing around in the desert doing absolutely nothing and getting paid by the hour. It shows you how wasteful we all are in various formats. Again, notice how the artist has naively depicted the shock wave from the Mars blast of the comet next year, maybe, as a circle. Now, look in here. Maybe this guy knows something because he's got geometry inside at the impact site. Maybe he knows a little bit more than you think he knows, that in fact, at the moment of impact, at these humongous energies, you are literally renting space-time. You are literally doing something to the ether, to the torsion field. And the interaction of those humongous energies between the field and matter, atoms, molecules, plasma, fragmented, molecular stuff, that creates a shimmering set of waves in the ether that are absolutely reflected in something called Chladni figures that were produced by a scientist in Europe, I think in the early part of the last century, where he took basic substances like little particulates suspended in water, shined a light on them, and then exposed them to acoustic waves, and found that as he changed the frequency and the intensity of the waves, he got changing geometric patterns. And you can Google, YouTube and Google are your friend. Just find this stuff, type in Chladni, which I think is Chaldni, and you'll find all kinds of amazingly cool stuff, including motion pictures of these patterns as they change the frequency on the sound generator. You'll see the patterns dramatically, suddenly, they don't transition, they suddenly change, which is why this physics doesn't let us predict things far in advance, because if you change the parameters, everything will suddenly change. There is no warning. That's why people who say that certain things coming can be predicted, they really don't know what they're talking about, because in this physics, change can happen suddenly if the frequencies in the ether in the torsion field are changed. So, we see this pattern. This is a very recursive. Does this look kind of familiar? Remember this yesterday? What do we call this? We call this a Relu triangle, or if it's a three-dimensional, a Relu tetrahedron. And notice the six-sided symmetry inside. Well, if we overlay this on the blast pattern created by a major impact on a planetary surface, lo and behold, let's take Herschel on Mimas. Here we have the shape of the crater that is left. So the reason that we have these geometric forms in solid state surfaces on a variety of planetary worlds all across this system is because the dynamics at the moment of the energy release at impact is literally being exemplified in the torsion field matter interaction. And they don't have to be gaseous or liquid surfaces for this to form, because at the moment of impact, that's what they turn into briefly: gaseous and liquid and plasma interactions. So this is why, when I saw this angle show up in the predictions of when this object, called, by the way, Comet Siding Springs, right down here, well, I turned to my right because I'm a hard-ribbed Republican. You understand that? Yeah, right. Okay. So, Comet Siding Springs. Why is it called Siding Springs? Well, it's not on railroad tracks, so we can dismiss that idea. It's actually called Siding Springs because the astronomer named Robert McNaught, who found this about a year ago, I think, found it at an Australian observatory called Siding Springs. And people who discover comets, as part of the IAU convention, get to name them anything they want, including Marella, if I ever discover one, or Robin. I have to do that. Or you could call it after the observatory. So McNaught decided to call it Siding Springs after the observatory that he found it at. Okay, if you could see the torsion field rippling between all of the bodies of the solar system, this is maybe what it might kind of maybe hopefully look like. Interference pattern, waves bouncing around, causing resonances and interference, phase angles and, positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement and a shimmering, wondrous exchange of energy. If you hit something in this dynamic system at the key angle of 60 degrees, what's it going to do to a member of that system as these energy patterns ripple through space at billions of times the speed of light? In other words, when this happens, and for us it's going to be early afternoon Albuquerque time, you won't be able to see Mars visibly from the southwestern deserts. But instantly, if there are effects in the hyperdimensional torsion field, we will experience them. And I, for one, haven't a clue as to what those effects could be. I think they will be partly physical, in that interesting things might happen with the aurora, and they also might affect consciousness of beings, of people, even little beings on the planet. And that may in fact be why someone has taken a great deal of trouble to arrange this. And how do I know that? Because things in the solar system just don't randomly hit other things at 19.5 hours Greenwich Mean Time, unless someone is sending a message. So this is one of the reasons that Robin and I went to Hawaii to carry out a set of experiments that go all the way back to the work of a Nobel laureate in economics named Dr. Maurice Allais. Maurice Allais actually began this modern epic of torsion field physics, the inquiry into, when in 1954, as he was doing measurements for some totally different reason in an underground SEAL laboratory underneath Paris, there happened to be on the 30th of June an eclipse that wandered by that afternoon. And his experimental technician, the guy in charge of his lab, was actually doing some work at that time. Allais was somewhere else. And the technician had enough presence of mind, even though he saw astonishing, weird stuff happening in the experiment, to continue the experiment. And not until after the weirdness went away did he stop, pick up the phone, call Allais and say, "You'll never guess what I just saw." So what did he see? He saw a pendulum which normally swings back and forth and rotates in a certain direction because of the Earth's rotation. He saw it during the eclipse do impossible things like stop swinging in one direction and rotate in the opposite direction through various phases of the eclipse. And they were totally baffled. No one had ever seen this before. No one had ever seen a phenomenon where an object moving under what are called inertial Newtonian dynamics would abruptly, for no apparent reason, stop moving and move in the opposite direction and continue oscillating between these modes for an hour or so. And remember, the technician is in a sealed basement lab with no windows, no closed-circuit TV, whatever, so he has no idea there's even an eclipse going on. It was only after he and Allais exchanged notes that they realized that they had observed something so amazing that apparently was connected to a solar eclipse that the scientific community simply, for decades, has not and would not believe them as to what had taken place. Fortunately, in 1959, another eclipse took place, and Allais was able to duplicate, which is really crucial in science. You have to be able to duplicate to confirm an original observation. When I got wind of all this, which was obviously decades later, and found a whole bunch of other experiments that were correlated, that had different kinds of pendulums, like what's called a torsion pendulum, which, by the way, is where the term torsion field comes from, because a torsion pendulum rotates in one plane and twists back and forth. Torsion comes from the root torque, meaning to rotate. And as you all know, the first three laws of hyperdimensional physics are rotation, rotation, rotation. So it was obvious to me that there had to be some intimate relationship between changes in the field, changes in the pattern of the pendula that Delay was using and observing, and changes in the hyperdimensional model of the solar system during an eclipse as a direct result. Nice theory. Be very nice if we could test it. As I did further work, I realized that it actually went back to the early decades of the 20th century, about 1913. A guy named Cartan combined his calculations with Einstein's relativistic calculations and produced the first papers on something called a torsion field, a field that should spiral through space under appropriate conditions. The problem is the original calculations showed that such fields would be restricted to atoms. They would be so minute in their effects that they would not be felt beyond the atom. Therefore, they were of interesting academic intrigue, but they had no practical value whatsoever. They couldn't even be measured. They were so tiny and small and insignificant on a cosmic scale. So how come we're talking about torsion field physics? Because in the 1950s, some other physicists at Caltech discovered that Cartan had made a mistake, a mathematical mistake in his calculations. And the effect of torsion fields, which also are called spin fields, because they come from things that rotate, rotation, 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 that he'd made a mistake by 22 orders of magnitude, which for those of you who understand silent notation is pretty damn embarrassing. I mean, that's one heck of a faux pas. 22 orders of magnitude is basically 1 followed by 21 zeros. It is, let's see, 10 would be 10 billion. So it's 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 to the power of infinity, quoting Forbidden Planet. In other words, it suddenly made torsion fields very, very detectable if you understood that the universe was trying to tell you. Now, Michio Kaku wrote this book, Hyperspace, which I recommend to everybody. It's a very good primer on all of these seminal discoveries going back, many, many, many decades in cosmology and field work, gauge theories, unified field pursuits, all of those high-tech physics things. But most important, by the way, do you notice what Kaku has on the cover of his book? He's got a cube. Why is a cube interesting? Because it's two interlocked tetrahedra, that's why. Anyway, the theory behind the torsion field model is that you have more than 3 dimensions in reality, in existence. And there could be 4 dimensions, 5 dimensions, 6. Well, how do you point to a spatial dimension which is beyond 3 dimensions? If you're trapped in 3 dimensions, as we are in this form, you can't. You can do it mathematically, but you can't experience it directly. You can experience indirect effects through mediating fields. For instance, this is the surface of a pond. It is a 2-dimensional surface. We're working on a metaphor now. If I take a drop of water from an eyedropper and I drop it into that pond, I will get a splash, a little splash, and then I will get ripples coming out from the introduction of an object from an unseen dimension, the 3rd dimension, into that 2-dimensional plane. And the ripples will carry energy. They will carry a signature in the form of amplitude, wavelength, all those things you can measure. And so what I can do is I can kind of work the clock backwards, and I can infer the size and energy and mass of the droplet from the eyedropper that I dropped into the pool of water or the pond. That's kind of what we're doing with the torsion field equations and mathematics of unseen dimensions and energy flows in the torsion field. We're taking the observed three-dimensional phenomenon, and we're trying to work backwards using known laws that work very well under all kinds of circumstances, and we're trying to predict the interference patterns in the field from the introduction via a spinning set of objects, the interference between them caused by the ripples and resonances in the torsion field as those waves of energy interact with each other in the three-dimensional ether. If that's not totally understandable, I would recommend Dark Mission, The Secret History of NASA, Chapter 2, which goes into great lengths and great detail on the hyperdimensional torsion field model. I had one of my intel sources, which in this case is a very good criteria of what you've done, tell me that it was probably the best explanation of the torsion field hyperdimensional model that he had seen. Now that was a couple of 3 years ago that he made this comment. If you don't want to pay for the book, which I can understand in today's economy, there is a free paper on the Enterprise website called A Most Hyperdimensional Eclipse, which not only goes into all the theory of the hyperfield that I've just described, it also goes into the historical precedents, Marie Salé, the other experiments, who they were, when they did, what they found, the representation of their results, all that. And it's all for free in Enterprise. Just look for A Most Hyperdimensional Eclipse. So the waves we're looking at have a certain frequency. These are long waves, these are short waves. A wave is a wave is a wave is a wave. And the laws operating among waves are the same, regardless of whether they're plasma waves, water waves, waves in the atmosphere, pressure waves, gravitational waves, which have never been found, and I don't think they will be under the current equations. They're an illusion based on physics, which is not quite real. They have a period, they have an amplitude, and you can, by applying wave equations, you can work backwards and, as I just said, decode what caused the waves. Here's raindrops in puddles. Raindrops keep falling down. Anyway, those kinds of ripples are emanating from all of the rotating and orbiting bodies in the solar system constantly. As a parenthetical remark, it's through the changes in the waves and ripples in the torsion field that astrology works. Yes, boys and girls, astrology works. And we call it hyperdimensional astrology because that's the mediating mechanism whereby if you're born at a certain latitude and longitude at a certain time and you come out of the mother's womb out from the shielding effects of water, because water screens torsion because of the hydrogen-oxygen bonding, that's when you are exposed for the first time in your life in 3D to the torsion field, and it imprints on you a signature pattern. Of course, there's all kinds of other stuff going on, so it's a small imprint, so it really doesn't determine your life, but it can influence. And that's ultimately a whole other discussion, which I will look forward to having someday. Anyway, this is the essence of how you create a hyperdimensional solar system of interacting torsion waves like ripples on a puddle on a street during a rainstorm. And as we have now demonstrated, when this thing hits on the 19th of October at 60 degrees to the sun and earth in that angular relationship, the ripples in the field should create a stunning set of ripples in the force and should cause all kinds of interesting things to happen in the hyperdimensional torsion field pattern, none of which, because we don't know enough yet, can I successfully predict for you. Maybe by a year and a half from now, when we get more data, and travel to more places and get more measurements and actually get some lab facilities, which we're working on, where we can do controlled experiments to see what certain influences will be. I'll be able to come back and tell you next year, if Jim invites us back, what it is that we anticipate happening in October of 2014. And then again, maybe not. Now, the reason this commercial is up here is because you definitely want to get it and look carefully at the genesis of this whole set of ideas, which came to me by looking at the monuments of Mars. And as I said, the three laws that govern all of this is all based on rotation. Allais himself said that you could not detect these changes unless your sensors were moving. Well, it's very hard to take a pendulum on an airplane various places. You know, the TSA folks look really, really weirdly at you if you try to climb on board an airplane with a pendulum. I don't think I've ever seen a pendulum. So what I did, I'm actually being a bit facetious there, but what I did was I thought to myself, how can we take and make portable so we can measure at various places around the world the torsion fields of various locations? If we adhere to the principles of Allais, which is you have to have a dynamic moving sensor, but it can't be something as big and cumbersome and delicate and fragile as a pendulum. This is where I took a hint from my friend, my departed friend Bruce De Palma, who in the 1970s, totally independent of Allais, because he'd never heard of Allais, this is before the internet, so you couldn't really get information freely if it wasn't published in a journal, and they wouldn't publish Allais' results in any scientific journal, so it wasn't published. He'd never heard of Allais, but he had done experiments in his own laboratory with spinning, rotating pendulums, and he discovered they had very bizarre mechanical, very non-Newtonian properties. They did not behave the way the standard textbook mechanics, chapter 2 in textbook on physics says they should behave. Particularly if the pendula on the rotating pendulum, if the plumb bob or the bob on the pendulum was spinning. He got really bizarre dynamic effects. So, genius that Bruce was, by the way, he's the departed brother of the famous director Brian De Palma. That's where you've heard the name De Palma before. And in fact, Brian never really got along with his brother while they were alive. I mean, I heard a lot of back and forth in my conversations with Bruce about his brother and how they didn't see eye to eye and how they, soap opera. Until Bruce unexpectedly died. And then Brian did something really, really cool. He did a film called Mission to Mars, which stars Tim Robbins, and I forget who else is, Gary Sinise is in it. It's really an interesting film. It's basically about the face on Mars, and in it you will see all kinds of demonstrations of rotation, spinning vortices. What he did was a lyrical homage to his brother's physics work. And quintessentially, at the end of the film, when the astronauts with Gary Sinise, most of them are inside the face on Mars, and there's one astronaut in the re-entry vehicle or the return vehicle that's counting down to when they have to lift off to basically make the rendezvous with Earth to get home safely, and you see a shot of his wristwatch. It's a digital wristwatch, and he's saying, "Guys, where are you, guys?" I forget the name of the actor. He did a film called Sliders. Very, very well-known young actor. Anyway, when they show that close-up shot of the watch, lo and behold, the countdown is approaching 19.47. Really cool. So Brian has totally redeemed himself in this wonderful homage to his brother, because his brother was a damn genius and did exquisite scientific work for which he will be acknowledged someday over and above the things I've tried to write, because Bruce De Palma figured out that if he took a new invention in the 1970s, which was a Bulova Accutron watch. I don't have an Accutron on today, but someday I'm going to get another one. I used to have one back when they were very brand new, never realizing the role that accutrons would play in my life. The accutron was billed by Bulova when it was first introduced in 1965 as the first major advance in timekeeping in 300 years. Because instead of balance wheels and escapements and springs and you wind it up and all that, it had a little tuning fork powered by a mercury battery down here, and the tuning fork would oscillate between these two coils, moving like that at 360 cycles per second. This is the actual naked tuning. You've never seen a naked tuning fork? Well, this is a naked tuning fork, okay? And these two little things fit in those coils, and there's a transistorized circuit in another part of the watch that actually flips the voltage back and forth. So it's constantly pinging the tuning fork to vibrate at its resonant cut frequency, because they can cut the steel tuning fork, it's made of steel, to vibrate at 360. And that produced, according to De Palma, the most amazing sensor, because he was able to do something that was categorically impossible by anything this man, who has become the deified icon of modern science, Albert Einstein, could ever have predicted. Because Einstein says the only way you can change mass is to move something very, very, very fast, close to the speed of light, and then its mass will increase. What De Palma found is that if you vibrate something, either a tuning fork or, this goes back to Allay's work, a pendulum, if the field in which that object is vibrating or swinging changes, it will change the mass of the tuning fork or the pendulum. Absolute, total contradiction and violation of everything Einstein ever wrote. I cannot overemphasize how incredibly, fundamentally explosive this discovery, this empirical discovery that Bruce De Palma made, is to all of current modern science. Because it basically sweeps it all away in one experiment and replaces it with this. This is our version of Bruce's experiment. What I've done, remember, he did his work in the 70s, so he didn't have computers, he didn't have, tuning, it didn't have, frequency standards and all that. He basically put his little accutron above a rotating turntable that weighed about 30 pounds and rotated at 8,000 RPM, 8,000 revolutions per minute. And it was made of concrete with a steel band around it to keep the concrete from exploding due to centrifugal forces. And he placed the he placed the accutron above this spinning disc and turned it on for 17 minutes. Why 17 minutes? Because that is 1,000 seconds. And he wanted an even number so we could do the division evenly. Bulova advertised that its accutron was accurate to plus or minus 2 seconds a day, which was a huge increase in accuracy over wristwatches up until that time. What De Palma measured in only 1,000 seconds, 17 minutes of putting the watch above a spinning disc, is that he was able to change the accutron time by 1 full second in only 17 minutes. Make it slow down, because he put it above the spinning poles. Turned out that if you put it above the equator, the watch sped up, because the field is not symmetrical. It's not a radial field, it is a geometric field, which is why when you do weird things to the field on planets, by impacting them with high energy objects, you get geometric frozen patterns in the rock or the other materials. So what I decided to do was to take Bruce's setup and just digitize it. Accutron, quartz crystal reference, which basically vibrates at millions of cycles per second, so it provides a constant time standard. Then some circuitry into a laptop, display the frequency of the tuning fork on the screen. The program I have, lower frequencies are displayed as going up, higher frequencies go down. Don't ask me why they wrote the software that way, it makes no sense. It's counterintuitive, but programmers are nuts, so, you know, I seriously mean that. They take a perfectly good program like Photoshop, and then they destroy it by adding more and more junk that you're paying over $1,000 for that you'll never, ever, ever use. Why? Because they're programmers. They have to make it better, even if it's only better for them and 5 friends. So in essence, what we've created is a tricorder. Now, I would really like a tricorder, and you're going to see in a couple of minutes here. How are we doing on time? Okay. We're doing pretty good. Because a tricorder would have solved and saved Robin and me from a lot of problems when we were in Mexico. We almost were physically incarcerated in Mexico for carrying out these measurements. And I will demonstrate for you how that happened and how we avoided it and what we found as a result. But yeah, there's some interesting adventures when you pursue science, particularly if it's science which is not sanctioned by officialdom. So since 2003, when I put this prototype tricorder together, we have measured a variety of celestial phenomena. We've measured astronomical phenomena, including eclipses, transits, conjunctions, alignments, and we have gone to many interesting places and measured actual ancient sites, ancient sacred sites, pyramids, stone circles, etc., because the model that I had in mind was these ancient sacred sites had to be doing something with the field, which is why they got the name of being sacred, because they produced effects that were not visibly connected to anything else. You just went there and interesting things happened. My model was that these ancient sacred sites were built by indigenous peoples thousands of years ago who knew something that we don't know, i.e., that the spinning Earth is disturbing the torsion field of the system, and if you put certain objects at power points around the Earth in a geometric pattern that conforms to the geometry underlying the field, those objects, or in this case, those constructions of millions of tons of limestone or millions of tons of granite or whatever, can act as an amplifier, a solid state amplifier of the torsion field, which, by the way, both Allais and De Palma, who they never met, never knew each other, and were using totally different experiments and instruments, independently came to the conclusion that the strength of the torsion field, which Bruce, by the way, called the odd field, because it was odd, he had a really, really great sense of humor, that field was about 10 to the minus fifth or 10 to the minus sixth of the normal fields we experience every day, like electricity, magnetism, gravity, which is only strong because there's so much mass to the Earth. That in fact, 10 to the minus 6 is about 1/millionth of the normal fields that we interact with. Fields like from rotating electricity and machinery and fans and AC motors and generators. And that's why 60 cycle current, by the way, is really, really, really bad for you. Because Tesla, when he set up the system, he basically set up a hyperdimensional system. Either to communicate how the universe really works when we could figure it out, or because he was so pissed off at Edison that he figured he would really do him in and produce alternating current that would ultimately kill him. So don't sit or live by things rotating at 60 cycles per second. That is not healthy for you. But the good news is, as you move away, the field drops off so rapidly that if you're more than a few feet away, you should be, fairly okay. Particularly if you have some kind of screening between you and the source of the rotating current. The other things we've done, as I said earlier, is to measure astronomical events and alignments and things like eclipses. This is a shot taken in Albuquerque of the annular eclipse a year ago on May 20th of 2012. And Robin and I had originally wanted to go someplace to a big torsion amplifier like a pyramid complex, ideally Giza, and measure this. But we couldn't do that because of logistics and money, and Egypt kind of blew up on our face about a year ago. Remember that? You know, it's still not a really cool place to hang out. Although there are indications now that things are getting better, so we're looking at actually going sometime in the not too distant future. So ultimately we wound up going up to the top of our Sandia mountain range, which is a huge 12,000 foot high mountain in our backyard covered by 1,000 feet of limestone. Why is limestone important? Because limestone is what the pyramids are made of. Why are the pyramids made of limestone? Because limestone turns out to be an incredibly important torsion active amplifying material. That's why the guys made the pyramids out of limestone. Both the Mayans and the Egyptians, and a bunch of other people. Like the Tholis at south of Silbury Hill in England is a huge pile of limestone carried in basket by basket by basket till they built up an artificial mountain, which we have measured. And I got really cool results. So during the eclipse, we're up on top of the Sandias, and we're measuring the eclipse. And this is two photos composited. The background photo is the moment of annularity, when the moon is right inside the photosphere of the sun optically. It's called annular eclipse because this annulus is the sun peeking out from behind. The moon, when you're seeing it like this, is far enough away in its elliptical orbit that it doesn't cover the sun. Haven't you always felt it was kind of weird that you have total eclipses where the sun and the moon are exactly the same optical size? Well, it gets even weirder, because the moon is 2,160 miles in diameter, and 2160 turns out to be a totally fundamental hyperdimensional torsion field number. Which means the moon is not totally natural. Somebody arranged it so that we could see it, measure it, and figure out the mathematics of our existence as part of this school that we're embedded in called the solar system. There are many, many other examples if you go through the orbits and the rotation periods and all that, which someday I will do, but I don't have time right now, obviously. Anyway, just a cool aside that when you look at the moon and look at the coincidence, again, of eclipses, it's not a coincidence. This obviously was designed to tell us about this physics and how it impinges and forms and shapes our very reality. So during the annular eclipse, you've got the sun, you've got the moon, and then look at this weird stuff, this wonderful weird stuff. These are actual readings from before the eclipse started, when the edge of the moon just touched this edge of the sun, and this huge thing happened. And after a couple of minutes, things settled down to where the frequency was higher, and you got all these wonderful spikes. You got some kind of symmetry. In other words, there is such exquisite data in this recording of the eclipse with the Accutron, kludge tricorder from last year. And none of it should be there. This should be a perfectly flat, straight line going right across, eclipse notwithstanding. What could possibly going on between the sun, 93 million miles away, the moon, 250,000 miles away, and the earth sitting on top of a 12,000 foot mountain with 1,000 feet of limestone on top of it? What can possibly have caused this line to go from a perfectly straight, flat line, like one of those cardiac moments on TV, to this? This is impossible. Again, this cannot be. This is totally impossible. But it's real. Which means that all the current physics is not. Experiment trumps theory. Sorry, that's the way it works. This is real data. You explain that. NSF, NASA, DOD, NSA, whoever, whatever alphabet agency wants to try to keep this suppressed. This is real data, and we got it from something as simple as a quartz crystal reference, a little Accutron watch, in which there's a tuning fork going boom at 360 cycles per second. Except it's not. It varies wildly, depending upon if you line up celestial objects that are spinning, then you are measuring the ripples in the field. Okay, here's the biggie. What the hell are we measuring? What does this funny, wavy, green line represent? Well, hang on to your seats, because this is where Einstein gets gently removed from the auditorium. We are measuring, I firmly believe, changes in the mass of the tuning fork, in the inertia, its resistance to motion. When the graph goes up, remember up is down and down is up, the frequency is lower on this display. When it goes down, the frequency is higher. Over on the left, when you actually see the real readings, you'll see a frequency scale. These spikes going down are higher frequencies where the pendulum is vibrating really, really, really fast. And when it goes up on the graph, it's vibrating really slow. Again, it's just sitting there, attached to a sensor that's wired into the computer, which is reading the comparative frequencies. Why is the tuning fork vibration rate changing? Because its inertia is changing. Inertia is the resistance to a force. F equals ma. Force equals mass times acceleration. You invert the equation, the acceleration is proportional to the force, or the mass. Higher mass, same force, lower vibration. Lower mass, same force, higher vibration. We're not changing any of the forces. We're changing the intrinsic property. When I say we, I mean the field is somehow changing the intrinsic property of the little tuning fork to vibrate faster or slower in total contradiction to everything scientists claim they currently believe. You are looking at a fundamental wrenching shock, not just a paradigm change, but a paradigm cliff that they don't want to jump off for some reason. Gosh, I can't imagine why. Okay, so we started this experiment in measuring the changes in the torsion field, i.e. the changes it produces in the inertia of moving objects, either rotating or vibrating, because they're both the same. When in 2004, Venus tracked across the sun. Now this is a plot from the 2012 transit, because they occur at every 120 years in pairs of two separated by 8 years because of the geometry of the solar system. Our orbits are not lined up exactly with Venus, so you can only have a transit when you're at what's called the node, which only occurs once every 120 some years because of the way the orbits shift. So we were fortunate to be able to measure not only the one in 2004, when Robin and I went to Coral Castle, but we also were able to measure from the top of the Sandias again. After the eclipse, I found it was a hell of a torsion amplifier, the transit of 2012. And we got astonishing results. Again, totally in contradiction to all theory. This is mind-blowing, historic stuff. At the end of the transit, when Venus was just touching the edge of the sun in 2004, all hell broke loose, as you can see. And the period of the first active sequence of ringing, that's where you get these spikes that go low, somewhat low, little low, less low, really less low. That's called ringing when it goes in a descending or descending frequency pattern. They corresponded exactly with what's called third to fourth contact. And then it started over, and then it started over. So you got sequential ringing on ringing on ringing, like you're ringing a bell, like you're creating a wave train in a medium, like you're looking at disturbances, rhythmic disturbances in the ether, in the torsion field, simply by the alignment of two rotating objects. Oh, did I mention that Venus rotates backwards compared to the Sun? So we didn't see this effect on the other end of the transit, which was the beginning, which was hours and hours and hours before. We only saw these amazing events in 2004 at the end, at around 7 o'clock in the morning. So, this is the result from the transit of 2012. Now we got more interesting graphics from satellites that were taking, H-alpha shots from orbit. We've got much higher sensitivity because we're parked on the top of a 12,000-foot solid-state torsion amplifier called the Sandia Mountains, and we get stunning effects just as the edge of Venus touches the chromosphere of the Sun. Look at this. Again, this is impossible. We should not be seeing any of this. And the really cool part, which was part of the prediction, and the prediction turned out to be true, I said that when two rotating objects basically cross each other's center of rotation, when you have one side coming toward you and one side going away, and you have the other side coming toward you in the opposite way with Venus because it's rotating backwards, and then the front side moving toward you and the back side going away, as you change physical position, as the transit proceeds and Venus moves across the Sun, across the spin axis, there should be some really interesting events at the moment the two spin axes cross, when you go from positive spin to negative spin. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happens. And look, it's pretty uneventful before, and all the interesting activity takes place after because Venus rotates backwards. It's like stirring coffee cream backwards in your coffee cup. You get really interesting vortices in the waves, in the field. And the upshot is, remember, we're measuring the change of inertia. This is your background. See that flat line? We should see that all the way across. There should be nothing going on like this. And yet, all hell breaks loose exactly when the theory says all hell should break loose. This is the foundation of science. So, making long story shorter, as the winter solstice of 2012 approached, Robin and I were invited to go to Chichen Itza, which is the center Mayan complex at the heart of the whole Mayan ethos and paradigm of obsession with timekeeping, end of the Baktun calendar, huge changes on planet, the whole thing because you lived through it. So we thought, oh, this is a really cool thing. We'll take up this invitation and we'll go, and we had to go by ship on a cruise ship. As you know, cruise ships lately have not gotten a good rap. We actually took the Triumph. Our ship was the Carnival Triumph, and it was 2 cruises later, 2 weeks later, that those 4,000 people had an experience the likes of which they will never, ever want to repeat in their lifetime. We got to know one of the crew members really well. She was my liaison with the bridge, so I could get correlated readings going down and going back. And she wrote to me, and she says it was really the cruise from hell. And this is an avid member, she's going to marry one of the officers on the ship. They live on the ship. They're now in Mobile, where the ship is being outfitted, re-outfitted, cleaned, of course, and completely refurbished from that week of hell. And she said that actually, for her to say that it was really, really, really bad, it had to be really, really awfully, awfully bad. Well, we were on that ship. And I cannot show you because I don't have time, but we actually measured changes in the physics when we docked a Progresso that I think caused the problems in the engine room 2 weeks later. And I don't remember whether I've actually got them in here. I probably don't. Because there's just so much you can do in one of these things. But we will put it on the web, and we will write papers, and so you'll be able to see the actual measurements, which I haven't had time to send her yet, because she got really interested in what we were doing and the measurements and all that. And I haven't sent her yet what I think caused the ultimate problems with the Triumph. Because remember, you have effects on rotation. And when we docked the Progresso, the effects on the Accutron were so mind-boggling. I really should have put that slide in here. I don't know why I didn't do that. I think it affected all kinds of rotating systems in the engine room, including things like fuel pumps. And if you destabilize rotating systems, eventually they're going to break down. So I think there is a direct correlation, because we also docked at dawn at Progresso. And the dawn part, when you're basically the sun is rising on the horizon, so you have a conjunction between the rotating sun, the rotating earth, and if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, meaning you're amplifying the field effects, which we saw on the ship, huge excursions in the frequency of the tuning fork in the Accutron. I think that set up a causal relationship that ultimately broke something in the rotating fuel pump machinery 2 weeks later. Because the following cruise, they had problems. Remember how they couldn't get up to speed? That was an indication they couldn't get enough fuel to the engines to turn them fast enough to turn the generators to basically make they had to drop one of the ports because they couldn't feed enough fuel into the engines to keep the props turning fast enough to keep the speed going up the ship to make their itinerary. There are some very important practical effects. Well, we get to Chichen Itza. This is an aerial view of this complex, and I wanted to measure the Kukulkan Pyramid on the theory that the Kukulkan Pyramid is one of the things the Mayans left as a memorial to the physics whereby their entire ethos and society was based, and which they felt the universe was functioning according to as well. The reason the calendars are changed, the reason you have key dates in these calendars, is because there's another set of clocks going. In addition to the Earth spinning on its axis, you have a much longer rotation, which is going backwards compared to the actual rotation of the Earth itself. This is called precession. And whereas the Earth rotates on its axis once every 24 hours, the precession takes 26,000 years to rotate once. Think of the ultra-low frequency effect in the field of a rotation that takes 26,000 years to rotate once. That is the basis of the Mayan calendar system. They mark their calendar according to the changes in the field, as I can now demonstrate, based on the precessional moment in time in these world epochs. You know, the first world, the second world, the third world, that kind of thing. Because they divided that precessional cycle into five symmetry periods of roughly 5,000 years each. Now, the theory was that each of these sacred structures, in resonating with this field, will create an overall effect that we should be able to pick up on our primitive tricorder. And if you want to see another layout of how we've been measuring some of these ancient monuments, I will call your attention to a special that NBC Sci-Fi shot and aired in 2009 called 2012 Startling New Secrets. And there you can see me and Robin running up and down pyramids like at Teotihuacan, this amazing pyramid of the sun. We were able to get up to the very tippy top, which is really steep up those stairs, climbing in semi-darkness with no sunlight, brilliant Venus and crescent moon, and Robin, you know, trying not to fall down. I had to carry the laptop, so I was kind of on my own. We finally get to the top. Here's one of our friends that helped us do some of this stuff. This is Jaime Mousson. All right, there's a pyramid of the moon in the background. We're on the pyramid of the sun. There I am holding the laptop. And I think, Jaime is actually holding the Accutron. All right. So we're at the top of the Pyramid of the Sun at dawn on the 22nd of April. And lo and behold, we get two wonderful spikes, as the theory predicts, at dawn on the top of this huge solid-state torsion field amplifier. I mean, the normal frequency, remember, is 360. The scale here is so small that the normal jitter is a straight line. And again, remember, none of this stuff should be presented. I should be sitting here or standing here presenting you graphs that have just straight lines. No deviation. No changes in the inertial field. Nothing that I'm showing you should be in existence according to current science and theory. And yet, observation trumps theory. This is real. We got a 719, we got a beautiful spike all the way up to 454. Remember, the normal frequency of the tuning fork is 360. How is it vibrating 100, cycles per second faster than it's supposed to? Here's the obligatory tourist shot, showing me with triumphant foot on rock, Robin smiling, because she's smiling. And we're in front of one of the huge pyramids that flank the ceremonial square, wearing these stupid hats because the sun was really, really bright. These are my readings from there, on the tippy-top step of the Pyramid of the Two Masks. Look at these stunning frequency excursions that should not exist. The highest vibration was up to 949 cycles per second. That's 3 times the normal rate of the tuning fork. The lowest was down to 14 and change, barely moving. What is causing the changes? Obviously, this structure, amplifying the ripples in the field, was showing changes in the background torsion field of the Earth at that time in the afternoon. Which brings us back to the really weird part of the cruise. You go from Galveston on this ship, the Triumph, and you dock at Progresso. You then go inland by about 2 hours to Chichen Itza. You then spend 2 or 3 hours there because they wasted all that time getting there by stopping at every damn tourist trap en route so that they get a kickback on all the hats that people were supposed to buy. It told me what not to do. You go on a cruise to be on a cruise. You go direct if you want to measure someplace because you cannot be on someone else's schedule, particularly if the authorities know you're on that schedule and they try to keep you from doing measurements because of that schedule, as you will see. Then we went around the Horn, Yucatan, over to Cozumel, and then all the way back across the Gulf of Mexico. We were actually about here in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico when the magic date, December 21, sunrise 2012, occurred, and then we arrived back in Galveston. Okay. This is Chichen Itza. This is Progresso. What they've done at Progresso, it's the only port into the Yucatan that the Mexican government has built in the last, I think, 10 years. This is a 4-mile-long concrete pier, which is being constantly vibrated by the wave action. Oh, I wish I put that graph in. Here. You can see it from space. These are satellite space images. And you dock at the end of it. So what I saw at the moment we docked, this pier is vibrating. Why is concrete important? Because concrete is a variety of limestone. It's a torsion active material. In this case, there are millions of tons of it stretching 4 miles out into the ocean, sitting anchored in limestone, which is the basement of the Gulf of Mexico. That's what's underneath the water. And it's so shallow from the Yucatan, because the Yucatan is all made of limestone, that they can't come closer to the shore than 4 miles. That's why the pier has to be 4 miles so you can dock a cruise ship. Then they cartoon buses and trucks and all. I mean, that pier had all kinds of interesting activity going on it when we were there. but it's basically a huge artificial structure which is rhythmically vibrating because of the wave action. And we docked at dawn. It is the world's most profound torsion amplifier that I think modern civilization has constructed on this planet. And just by accident, or something else, we were there at the right time and the right place to measure it, and the field effects are what I think destroyed the engine room, many days later on the Triumph itself. So here's Chichen Itza. One of the things I learned in England is that you have to creep up on these places and measure them very carefully. Another reason I wanted to creep up on this place and measure it carefully is because on July 24th of 2009, a tourist with his family from, I think, Costa Rica, took two pictures of the Kukulkan Pyramid. This is from the ball court, by the way. And the second picture showed this astonishing beam right up from the pyramid, which, of course, instantly I thought, it's got to be a hoax. To her reportorial credit, it was Linda Moulton Howe, a name I think you probably are familiar with, who tracked down the tourist himself, his wife, and their two little daughters, and got the story of how he took these pictures. He took one without the beam, and then one, I've cropped it here so that you just see the pyramid. The little girls are standing in front and they're saying, "Daddy, it's raining." Because it was raining. There was a thunderstorm going on, and you can see actually in the backdrop right around here. You see the lightning bolt? One theory as to where this beam is coming from is that somehow there is a piece of ancient high-tech torsion technology buried under the pyramid. And it either was activated by the weird electric field of the thunderstorm, such that this tourist could take the pictures on his iPhone. And the reason Linda found out it was all real, can you imagine a Costa Rican tourist carefully faking this? Impossible. Because right after it all happened, he's on the bus going back to the hotel, showing people, "Look what I got on my phone. Look what everything she found bent the story in the direction that it was real. But if it's real, it's impossible, and it's very dangerous to current society, particularly the federales, because it means there's something really important underneath, and it's energetic, and it does weird things, and no one knows what it's doing there, or what it's doing, and why that beam shot into space. And it actually may have been part of a countdown to the end of the Baktun calendar, because that's the end of the Baktun calendar, synchronized with the end of the precessional cycle, when the Earth and Sun line up close to the galactic center, which hasn't happened for 26,000 years. And as we've measured, alignments in this physics are uber important. They're everything. So here you are, you're driving along on these nice roads in Mexico and the Yucatan, and there's this little town called Piste, which is located about 1.5 miles from Chichen Itza. So the really cool thing is I had wanted to stop periodically as we got closer and make measurements. Because in England, I measured an ancient complex. I can't tell you which one because I don't want the authorities to go and dig up what we think we found. 1/2 mile away. 1/2 mile. The Accutron instrument readings froze. The energy was so strong. The frequency went above 1,000, and the poor thing just said, "I quit. You expect too much of me. I quit." So I realized that we were probably measuring something that was ancient and buried under this ancient complex. So from then on, the protocol was I would stop miles away and get readings, and go closer, then stop and get more readings. Fortunately, in Mexico, they stop every few minutes so you can buy touristy stuff. So I'm here in this parking lot. While everybody else is off the bus, I'm sitting on the bus. Bus is closed, air conditioning is off, it's Mexico, it's warm, and I'm measuring. And this is the model, that from this complex there'd be field effects, and way over here in Pista, I should be able to measure some of these effects, even though the complex is located here. Here's a close-up. Here's a scale close-up showing actually the number of miles. It's 1.72 miles from where we measured in this parking lot right here to the Hoagland Pyramid. And this is what Pista looks like. Isn't that touristy? Here are the readings. This far away, we got these low amplitude readings. A wave came through, it lowered the frequency here, and then it jumped up very abruptly here. And I'm almost 2 miles away. This told me something really, really important about what was going to happen. Here's a close-up, all right? Here's background readings. Background is 360.015. Then it lowered down to 360.011. Now you may say, come on, Hoagland, that's not a change. That's in the noise. No, because we are measuring frequencies to 1 part in a million. We are 1,000 times above the noise. So every change you see here is real stuff happening in the field, particularly this drop. Remember, up is down and down is up. The period, see, it lasted a little over 4 minutes, and then suddenly, boom, zoom back up to background. So a low frequency hiccup in the force passed us. It may have been the focus combined effects of all those tourists frantically buying all those Mexican souvenirs. I don't know. Okay, moving on. So now we're at, we're back in Albuquerque. This is the pre-baseline calibration. And you can see what a normal background calibration looks like. It's a perfectly straight line with little jiggles in the field. This is a comparison between Albuquerque baseline and 1.5 miles from Chichen Itza. This is real data. So I was really encouraged we were going to see something really cool when we finally got to where we were going, which is here. Here's the Hoagland Pyramid. Here's the famous ball court. Now we're driving into the parking lot, which you come down this little road and you go into here, and there's a parking lot where they put buses, which is right here. So I thought, okay, this is a good place before we get into the complex, which is over here is the pyramid, you know, and here. We'll measure it from there. So I do. Here's the bus parking lot. Here's where the pyramid is. You basically stop here, walk to the entrance, go through an entrance, through a turnstile, and into the complex. And I'm saving all the soap opera for later. Here's close-ups of buses in parking lot. Here's how you get to the pyramid. Here's the field superimposed that I'm thinking is going on. Here's the little accutron. And we did an interesting experiment. For some reason, the accutron can tend to be cantankerous. Remember, this is what Bullitt has advertised as being accurate plus or minus 2 seconds a day. And yet what I found is that it really has its own personality. And on this particular trip, it basically decided to go on strike. So, in desperation, I asked someone to basically come and sit beside me and pick it up and hold it and think nice thoughts at it. Seriously. You think I'm nuts. Well, remember, part of the model is the torsion field is affected by consciousness and vice versa. So if that model is true, if you're dealing with, I mean, look, we've all had experiences where a piece of machinery just refuses to work.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's weird. It's almost like they have personalities. Like some days, you know, you go to start your car, you're late for something really crucial, a major life-changing event, you're going to have an appointment to a job or something, you go out, nothing. You know, it happens every time. So the little Accutron is acting weird, so I have this person hold the Accutron and just think nice thoughts. This is holding the Accutron. When the person put the Accutron down on the seat in the bus, notice the sudden change in the waves. Let me see if I've got a close-up here. Yeah, okay? Look at this pattern, then look at this pattern. It obviously was responding to this individual's presence. Not only did it suddenly start to work again, but it worked in a very dramatic way with a definite step function at the moment it was placed on the seat next to me and continued to work. That to me was the first actual scientific measurement I had of the interaction of this object with a human being, with a human consciousness. Very important data point. So now we go in through the entrance, which is here, and there's the obligatory sign. This is us walking in. I'm carrying, the Accutron, the laptop, and all that in the bag. There's a whole other backstory that I don't have time to go into, which is really, really soap opera-ish, because it turns out that the people who had booked our cruise to have me go measure the pyramid had not bothered to get the proper permits. They said, well, we didn't know you were bringing equipment in. This is after they'd asked me to write up for the website what I was bringing in and why I was taking 50 people who had all paid several $100s to accompany us into watching us measure and helping us measure the Chichen Itza pyramid. Be careful who you book your cruises with. That's all I can say. So now we're inside this. By the way, notice the shape of this. Does that remind you of anything? Does that remind you of the doorways to the Krell Labs in Forbidden Planet? Okay. So now we're at the other side. This is the entrance looked at from the other side. These are the turnstiles that you have to go through. All right. And this is us playing tourist, heading toward the pyramid. You walk from the entrance, which is here, over to the pyramid here, which we did. This is us now actually measuring under a tree next to the pyramid. And lo and behold, this guy shows up. This is a federale. I had no sooner taken out the laptop and the Accutron than suddenly this guy shows up and says to me and to Robin and Ted St. Rain, who was filming everything, oh, you can't do that. That's not permitted. You have to go to the administration office. So Robin engages this guy in interested, animated dialogue. Notice how interested he is, okay? While I'm setting things up, trying to get measurements before I'm hauled off to the caboose. Now, you can see my expression. It's like, you gotta be kidding. You're arresting me for opening a laptop? I mean, look at these folks. Not bothering them. See, this guy's got pot in his jeans over here. Perfectly fine. Do not open laptop under shade of pyramid. See, now this is Robin engaging in diversion activity while I'm frantically setting up equipment and, Notice my effort to stop the inevitable. Notice he's really into this. Dumb tourista. But while this is all going on, here's the Accutron, here's the laptop, there's the crystal reference. I'm getting wonderful readings. Wonderful. Now, he directs us, and I've taken out a lot of slides because it would have taken up too much time, but he directs us that we have to literally walk all the way back and we have to go to the administration building, which is right here. During the rest of my stay, since we had to comply, I was thinking, remember the Marine who just a couple weeks before this had been arrested for having a shotgun that was, I think, 1/4 inch too long. And he was still in prison when we were in Mexico, and I had thoughts, because when you're there in Mexico, you're not protected by anything. Consulates, ambassadors, you're on your own. And they can do whatever they want with you, and I don't think being in a Mexican prison during the 2012 solstice is exactly what I had thought of when we planned the trip. So I'm trying to be compliant and still get something. So he walks us back. Actually, he doesn't walk us back. He directs us. And what's really weird is that another guard took over at the pyramid and escorted us all the way back to this administration building, where they had me standing for an hour and a half cooling my heels with nothing going on, they thought. Because here's the laptop, here's the Accutron, and we're measuring. And we know we're getting readings because I can see them on the screen. And the thing I didn't want them to do was to basically abscond with my laptop. But it's obvious that down at the lower level of the pecking order, they had not been told what we were doing or why it was detrimental to the national security of Mexico. You know, I'm such a terror. Oh, I have to be careful of using that word these days, right? So Robin is doing her diversionary thing. She goes in and she argues with them and she says, we'll give you money and we'll write anything, you know. All the while I'm standing out there getting readings because I basically perched the instrumentation on a trash can. And we got amazing readings, leaping to the end. We on this cruise had 2 separate groups of people. We had the 50 people that I was supposed to take in as part of our measurement thing. And then they had contracted with a guy named Han Budsman, who's a Mayan elder who lives not far from Chichen Itza. And he had 100 people. In fact, the organizer said to me, I don't know why you have so many people compared to Han Budsman, which tells me where his mind was. Anyway, yeah, we didn't think you were going to bring equipment in. Okay. Anyway, these are the readings, and the reason this is marked in different colors is because this was the reading as I started firing up the laptop with the guard standing over my shoulder. Let me look at the time here. It's 12:03:25 local time. And then the frequency suddenly jumps down at 12:04:35 p.m. And the reason these times and this change is important, and then you've got this weird inverted spike. Remember, up is down, down is up, so the frequency is lower when it goes up, and it's higher when it goes down. And then you have all this interesting activity, and then you've got this stuff going on over here. Okay, bottom line. This was the first time we had measured an ancient ceremonial sacred site where a whole bunch of people, like 100 in the Ombudsman group and 50 folks in our group, were doing combined meditations in the complex. And what I now know, because I asked my folks to take notebooks or their cell phones, you were not arrested for having a cell phone, so I'm going to try to reduce everything that you saw in the schematic, I'm going to try to reduce it to the size of a tricorder, a cell phone, so I can sneak into places and measure things no one will ever know we're measuring because we're just using our phone, right? Yeah, right. Anyway, I had our folks monitoring according to times when they saw interesting things happening during our little expedition, which included when the Ombudsman group started and stopped their meditations. This is the moment when they stopped their meditations. This is the moment when they were told by their federales that they didn't have the proper permit to meditate in front of the pyramid, and they all were told they had to leave, and look what the frequency did. It went way down. In other words, their disappointment is expressed in a change in the vibration rate of the vibrating tuning fork in perfect synchronization with their consciousness. And I've got lots more data showing this, including the readings we got as we tracked from here all the way back over to the entrance. But I don't have time to show, so that will appear on a write-up on Enterprise in the not-too-distant future. Actually, I've got, 2 months between we have to do the next thing? So maybe I can actually get something written. Which brings us to Hawaii, here. And the stunning comparison between Oahu and Honolulu over here, and Hilo over here, and where all the telescopes are. Because in the model that the physics is anchored to the geometry of geodetic location on the planet, the idea of being able to go and measure at 19.5, and furthermore to measure an eclipse, a partial eclipse mirroring the geometry we got a year ago on the Sandias at 19.5, was overwhelmingly attractive. And you can actually see, this is the 19.5 latitude line that goes right through Mauna Kea, and Hilo is down here. So, this is the setup. This is where we are to measure. We arrive. This is a comparison now. This is my first contact enormous effects from the eclipse in 2012. This is an expanded version. Remember, this is background before you get to the eclipse moment of first contact. Then, bang, all kinds of amazing things happen. So I'm looking to duplicate, as science does, during this eclipse, the astonishing results we got during our first eclipse. This is the geometry of the 2012 eclipse, and Hawaii is located right about here. So we were not anywhere near the geometry of the eclipse in relation to Hawaii on this one, but it went across the United States, and so we're measuring it over there in New Mexico. This is the geometry of the beginning of the eclipse from Albuquerque. This is the May 20th eclipse. Notice that it's crossing the center line of the sun at the moment that I've chosen here to display. This is the geometry of the Hawaiian eclipse, rotated 90 degrees, because it didn't enter from the full side. It just crossed in the southern hemisphere, staying always below the equator, and then moving off in this direction. So it would give me a variety of geometries to measure, as well as, here's the actual track going just south of the islands. There's the islands up there. So it heads toward you and then it moves away, and we're measuring all the while it's doing that. This is the background in Hawaii from Hilo 36 hours before the eclipse. This is our first 19.5 readings. And what's really interesting is that the head of the lodge asked me the next morning, well, what'd you get? What'd you get? And I had to tell him truthfully, nothing. Now, unfortunately, he didn't understand I only meant nothing for that moment. He thought I meant nothing from Hawaii, therefore we were going to basically pack up and go home. And there's another long soap opera as to certain things that were supposed to happen that didn't happen because he misinterpreted what I said. But this is important data. What it shows you is that even from 19.5, if there's nothing going on in the field that's interesting, you're not going to measure anything going on even at 19.5. And the reason I can say that is because when there is something interesting, you really get to measure it. At this point, even though this looks like nothing is happening, the computer Accutron setup lost 2 hours. It suddenly stopped. It refused to function. And the only way you can tell is by sliding the cursor along the timeline, the baseline, and what you see is that it jumps from 6:53:37 a.m. because I wanted to measure sunrise even while we were sleeping to compare to Teotihuacan. And then the next reading is 8:58:31. And yet there's no change in the reading. Now I wish I could stand here and tell you what I know that means. I haven't a clue. I don't know yet. This is what science is. This is, by the way, how Robin and I met. I gave a whole presentation in Las Vegas on radar rings. And at the end, I said, I haven't a clue as to what's going on. And she got so furious that we almost never met. She was astonished later when we actually had dinner or something. And she said, oh, you turned out to be a nice guy. I thought you were such a scumbag, you know. Get all those people together and then tell them you don't know what the hell's going on? What kind of a presentation is that? It's called science. When you don't know what's going on, you tell people that you don't know. And the next time we get together, maybe I'll have figured it out, which will hopefully make you come back to listen to the rest of the story. So yeah, it lost 2 hours in the space of 1 second, because this thing is measuring in 1 second intervals. Blip, 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 blip. That's your sample rate. Okay, here we are. This is the big island, Oahu, with the airports and the worst traffic jams in the United States, we found out from tourists there. This is where we were. Here's Hilo, here's Mauna Kea in the middle, and then Kona on the other side. By the way, the road to Kona takes you from Hilo right across that huge 14,000-foot high mountain on a good day. And there are lots of days when the weather is up there you can't go across because it's not good. Okay, here we are. It's now the next day. We got there a couple days ahead of time because I wanted baseline before the eclipse. We arrived on the afternoon, the evening of the 7th, started measuring around 1 o'clock in the morning. So I'm getting measurements on the 8th at pre-dawn. On the 9th at pre-dawn, roughly 12 hours before the eclipse, I get them again. This is the setup. Okay, these are the beginning readings from just about 11 hours before the eclipse. Okay, look very similar, right? Baseline, background, I've got a couple of things tabulated. Nothing to write home about. I'm at 19.5. I'm thinking, this is sucky. That's a technical term for when your model absolutely doesn't cooperate. I mean, come on, I'm at 19.5. God, folks, do something. And then all hell breaks loose. Now remember, we're not watching this in real time. Robin and I are snoozing peacefully while the computer sitting on the other side of this little nice bungalow room is quietly accumulating data. Nothing is changing. This is not recording our dreams or anything else interesting. It's just recording data. And suddenly, at 3:13 a.m. and change, all hell breaks loose. Let me give you a wider shot. This is now amplitude reduced, so you can see the background is basically just a straight line. But there's this weird stuff in the middle of this ascending frequency. So the frequency is going... and then over here it goes... You like that, huh? You should hear me sing in the shower. Actually, you shouldn't. And then you've got this pattern. All right? I mean, this is absolutely mind-blowing. Oh, and by the way, the computer right here froze for 1 hour. Just stopped. This is a representation of the information plots. This is a ring I found which shows basically a frequency symbol that you use in electronics for frequencies. So you've got very smooth changes of frequency and then a whole jumble of vibrations. And then you've got something here that looks overwhelmingly like what's patterned on the right, a square wave. In other words, I'm beginning to think as I'm looking at, this is the whole plot now. This is a couple of hours after all hell breaks loose at 3:13 a.m. I'm saying to myself, particularly this geometry over here, way over there, I've only seen this once before. It occurred in the Enterprise offices at the base of the Sandias, and it it seems to me as if we're looking at some kind of coded, deliberate information, like it's an artificial signal. I mean, look, if you can send information via radio, EM waves, you should be able to send information via torsion waves. The advantage is radio waves are limited to 186,000 miles per second. It takes 8 minutes for light to travel from the sun to the earth. It takes a quarter second to travel from the moon to the earth to the moon. It takes 5 hours. I used to tell Walter Cronkite that by the time he was doing the 11 o'clock news, his first broadcast at 6:30 p.m. would be leaving the solar system. That really got him. But light is really, 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 really slow compared to torsion. Because torsion is, we think, because no one's able to measure it yet, billions of times the speed of light, which means it's instantaneous. It's kind of like a Dirac transmitter, if anybody ever used to read E. Doc Lensman years ago. Here's a close-up of this data. These are time intervals showing decreasing wave trains. This is what was going on, I found out in retrospect. At the moment all of this weirdness starts, Mars is just coming out from behind the moon. And we think, long story, that there's somebody inhabiting bases on the moon at the North and the South Pole. Long story, no time to tell you, but there is data indicating somebody is on the moon. Thank you. And this moment, when Mars just clears the edge of the moon, coinciding with the moment when all this breaks loose, got me very suspicious, particularly because we're looking at geometry. Now, anybody remember historically the early discussions of how we were going to send signals to aliens, or they were going to send signals to us? Frank Drake and Carl Sagan and Project Ozma, listening for codes coming from Epsilon Eridani and Tau Ceti and all that back in the 60s. The idea was that you would send basic mathematical theorems or geometry to familiarize your intended audience with your language and begin a dialogue to where you could teach them, your language, and you would use the interlingua of science, of mathematics. The only thing that we basically have in common to start with some other culture, some other place in the solar system or the galaxy or whatever. This looked suspiciously like somebody trying to teach us something, supered on a background of natural weird stuff with incredibly frequency changes. The frequency range here on this one goes up to 8,072 cycles per second. Remember, the normal frequency of the accutron is 360. So this begins to get me thinking, are we looking at beat frequency phenomenon between the accutron, which is almost standing still compared to an 8,000 cycle frequency, and changes in the quartz crystal, which is the clock frequency in my reference box and also the clock frequency in every computer all over the world. Quartz, this beautiful little guy. I mean, I am so kicking myself that I didn't bring the accutron set up with me on this trip, because somebody didn't tell me you were going to have quartz crystals all over the damn place that I could have measured, because I could have shown you in real time these things are active torsion amplifiers. But we've made arrangements to go to Arkansas to measure in the mine where these things come from, and to a couple of museums where there are huge quartz crystals which formed earlier in the history of the Earth when the physics was different, and they should be tuned amplifiers of extraordinary efficiency. And so we'll have a whole bunch of new data when Jim gets this party together next year, and we have more of these cool things sitting around that we can show you do cool things. Now, the other thing I found, because I was really trying to figure out something out so I couldn't have to just stand here and say, you know, when I show you all these graphs, damn if I know. Looks interesting, haven't a clue. In addition to, at that moment when these signals came in, Mars just clearing the edge of the moon, another weird thing was happening simultaneously. This is a plot in redshift of the sun and the moon approaching each other. Here's the visible Earth horizon in helo. And you'll notice that the sun is well below the horizon. This is 3:13 a.m. at the moment when those signals started coming in. Bizarre, wondrous signals, almost 12 hours before the eclipse. And this is a close-up showing the relationship between the sun and the moon. Here's the moon closing in on the sun, so it's going to cross the southern hemisphere in about 11 hours. But at the moment, at the exact moment that this starts happening, the sun is exactly 33 degrees below the horizon. And if you have followed any of our work, you know that 33 degrees is an inherent part of the physics, but more importantly, it is the signature number of the Masons. And it is a ritual number we have found in NASA alignments and launches and landings and flybys and all that going back decades. So the tentative conclusion I can come up with is the guys on Mars who chose that moment to communicate either with the moon base at the two poles of the moon or with Earth when the moon was in close relationship also chose the moment when the sun was exactly 33 degrees below the horizon. Not from anywhere else on Earth except Hilo, Hawaii. In other words, when we were there measuring. This is some of the plots I got in Albuquerque a few months ago showing this bizarre square wave stuff, which I think are signals. Here's another version. Never seen this before. Robin was back in Miami, so I was all by myself recording this. This is what HAARP looks like, by the way. Very even frequency waves, long discussion about HAARP I don't have time to go into. Back to the eclipse. This is eclipse day. This is basically what the eclipse looked like. Nothing until the eclipse started. Then HAARP started and completely blanked out any possibility of readings. Did they do it deliberately? This is, by the way, the geometry. I think they did it deliberately so we couldn't get readings. Remember, I had wanted to compare the beginning of the eclipse from Albuquerque with the beginning of the eclipse from Hawaii. Nothing because the HAARP interference, just like the Russians. One final set of data. After the eclipse, as part of a procedure in science, you have to measure post as well as before. This gives you calibration. This is 2 days after the eclipse. Again, same period, before dawn. Suddenly, we get a huge jump down in frequency and a lot of material. Then HAARP starts again. Kind of like getting our range. That's interesting data. This is now on May 11th, 2 days after the eclipse, 3:10 a.m. to 3:25. Notice the strange rhythmic patterns. The amplitude remains the same, but you get these rolling waves where you get alternate frequencies, high and low, and spike, 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 spike. But they're not even. They're like increasing or decreasing harmonic ringings. This is the inversion. A few minutes later, the high frequencies take over, and then it's spiking on the low frequency side. When this is plotted on an averaging plot for the entire 3 hours, it shows a interesting decreasing amplitude wave train, almost like you had thrown a stone into a pond and you get these boom, 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 waves out into the future, into space and time. Is this an echo in the torsion field of the eclipse? Again, we're measuring all this from 19.5. Obviously, we have to go back. We have to look at the detailed physics. I actually need to set up stations to actually have them remotely transmit their data through the internet so we can compare live readings from multiple places, sacred sites, geodetic places, all that. That requires funding, it requires a lot of work, it requires cooperation. But we're at the beginning of a science that I think is so profound because it's a science of how planets function. This is the latitude of the Great Red Spot, 19.5. This is the dynamics of the sun with the peak of sunspot latitudes at 19.5 north and south. And so from little Hawaii, we find the key to possibly one of the most important practical problems of our age, which is exemplified by this stunning shot from Oklahoma. This is the terrible Oklahoma tornado. This is the track of the tornado compared to the track of the tornado several years ago. Eerily similar. Total mystery. What could have been going on? This is the devastation. Cars overturned, buildings destroyed. This is the hospital that was destroyed. This is a car obviously mangled to death by impacts from the tornado. This is what it looks like. Nothing left from an F5. 24 people killed. Hundreds injured. Thousands of properties totally destroyed. A community terrorized because they cannot predict when this will happen again and they can't seem to do anything about it. This is a live horse being led in excellent shape off the top of the destroyed school, the Briarwood School, toward another horse that was found in the school yard simultaneously in perfect condition, after having somehow been flown by the tornado over a mile from the stables outside of the suburb. And nothing happened. I believe that this field is somehow responsible for levitating those living creatures as opposed to dead stuff, cars and rocks and stones and 2x4s. And that it picked them up, changed their inertia through their own biofields that I measured in Chichen Itza, and then lowered them as the tornado strength dissipated gently back down to the earth, in this case to the top of what was remaining of that school, so that guy had to literally walk him down to safety. And this means I have another thing on my bucket list. I have got to go and measure a tornado. Robin is not happy. Morella is definitely not happy at the idea of me measuring a tornado with the Accutron system.
What's the longitude and latitude of it?
Exactly. I have to go and look at all that. And what I'm going to do in place of putting myself in the middle of an F5 is I'm going to find some nice, friendly storm chasers who do this for a living. And I will give them a setup and have them go and get me a range of measurements, and we'll all wind up on the Weather Channel very, very, very famous. That is, unless something really amazing happens on October 19th of 2014, when this object hits Mars, and all of us meet here again to talk about a totally new paradigm. Thank you.